Hey YNR fans! Welcome to YNR Trends, your young and the restless updates, shocking spoilers, and all the drama. So grab your coffee, hit that subscribe button, and let's dive right into Genoa City's hottest gossip. Here's the beginning of your 2,000-word story, written in long continuous paragraphs, no headlines, emotional and realistic for a YouTube narration. I'll write it in parts since 2,000 words is long. This is part 1, and we can continue step by step until the full length is reached. Claire had been glowing for weeks, holding on tightly to the dream of becoming a mother despite all the chaos surrounding her life in Genoa City. She had carried herself with a new sense of purpose, imagining every little detail about the baby's future, tiny socks in a dresser drawer, lullabies whispered in a quiet nursery, and the thought of Kyle standing by her side as they navigated this journey together. It was fragile, it was hopeful, and it was the kind of fragile happiness that could shatter with the slightest blow. That night in the Abbott mansion, tension was thick in the air as Audra confronted her once again. Words flew like daggers, sharpened by bitterness and jealousy. Audra had always been the kind of woman who needed to win, who thrived on control and manipulation, but Claire's pregnancy had shifted the balance. For once, Audra wasn't the one holding all the cards, and the resentment that brewed inside her had been growing into something dangerous. Claire, clutching her stomach protectively, stood her ground, determined not to let Audra's venom infect the joy she had finally found. The argument spiraled quickly, louder than either of them intended, echoing down the hallway where Kyle had been moments away from stepping in. Audra accused Claire of trapping Kyle, of using the baby as leverage, her voice rising with each accusation. Claire, exhausted and emotional, tried to defend herself, insisting that her love for Kyle was real, that her baby was a blessing and not a bargaining chip. But the fury in Audra's eyes wasn't calming. It was intensifying, and in a split second, the unthinkable happened. Audra reached out, not with intent to physically harm, but with the reckless push of someone who had lost control. Claire stumbled backward, her feet catching the edge of the step, and everything slowed into a horrifying blur. Kyle's voice shouted out as he appeared at the top of the stairs, but it was too late. Claire's body fell, tumbling down, her scream piercing the silence before the thud at the bottom made the entire world collapse. Kyle rushed down the stairs faster than his legs could carry him, his heart pounding in his chest, the sight of Claire crumpled on the floor filling him with terror he had never felt before. He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he tried to rouse her, his voice cracking with desperation. Claire's face was pale, pain etched across every line, and the blood pooling beneath her sent shockwaves of fear through him. "No, no, no. This can't be happening," he whispered, his hands hovering over her as if touching her too roughly would make things worse. Audra stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her hand clamped over her mouth, the weight of what had just happened hitting her in waves that made her knees buckle. She hadn't meant for this, but intent didn't matter anymore. The damage was done, and Kyle's anguished cries told her more than words ever could, something irreversible had been broken. The ambulance arrived in a blur of flashing lights and urgency, with Kyle refusing to leave Claire's side even for a second. He rode with her, holding her hand, whispering promises that everything would be all right even though he could feel in his bones that those words were lies. Every bump of the ride seemed to take something more from her, and he begged her to hold on, to fight for both herself and the baby they had dreamed of together. At the hospital, doctors and nurses swept her away, leaving Kyle pacing outside the doors, his chest tight, his mind replaying the fall over and over like a nightmare on repeat. Audra arrived minutes later, her face pale but still cloaked in that defensive edge she wore like armor. She muttered words about not meaning for it to happen, about how Claire shouldn't have pushed her, but Kyle wasn't hearing any of it. His ears were ringing, his vision blurred with rage, and when Audra dared to step closer, when she dared to act as though she had any right to be there, something inside him snapped. Kyle's hand flew across her face before he even realized it, the sharp sound of the slap cracking through the sterile hospital air. Audra gasped, more in shock than pain, her eyes wide as she staggered back. "You did this!" Kyle roared, his voice raw with grief and fury. "You took everything from her, from us." His chest heaved, his fists clenched, his body shaking as the weight of everything he was losing consumed him. Audra, for once, didn't have a clever retort. Her eyes brimmed with tears, not just from the sting of the slap but from the crushing realization that her reckless bitterness had destroyed more than she ever intended. But Kyle didn't care about her tears. He only cared about the woman behind those hospital doors and the fragile life they were trying to save. Hours stretched on like years as Kyle sat in the waiting room, his head buried in his hands, his mind drifting between hope and despair. The doctor finally emerged, and Kyle's stomach dropped at the solemn look on his face. The words hit him like a death sentence: the baby hadn't made it. Claire had miscarried. For a moment, Kyle couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. His world tilted on its axis, every dream he had allowed himself to believe in shattering into dust. When they finally let him into Claire's room, he found her pale and broken, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She didn't even have to say the words, he already knew. He sat beside her, taking her hand in his own tears falling freely as he whispered over and over, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Summer had been preparing for this moment for weeks, but even as her plane touched down in Nice, she could feel the tightness in her chest, the nervous thrum of her heartbeat that wouldn't let up. The Mediterranean air should have felt like freedom, salty and warm against her skin, but all she could think about was Kyle and the little girl sitting next to her on the plane. The child looked so peaceful, curled up against Summer's arm with a small blanket tucked under her chin, completely unaware of the storm swirling around the adults who would soon shape her future. Summer brushed a strand of hair from the girl's forehead, her hand trembling slightly. This wasn't just any child, this was Kyle's daughter. The daughter he didn't even know existed, the one Summer had sworn she'd protect until the truth could no longer stay hidden. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "It's time, sweetheart. It's time he finally knows you." The taxi ride from the airport to the villa was long enough for Summer's thoughts to run wild. Every olive tree and stone wall blurred into a haze as she rehearsed the words she would say when she finally faced Kyle. She had imagined it so many times, Kyle's shock, his denial, maybe even his anger. But she also imagined the moment his eyes would land on the little girl, the way recognition would pass over him like lightning, undeniable and life-changing. The child shifted sleepily in her seat beside her, clutching a small stuffed bunny that had seen better days, and Summer felt her throat tighten. She wasn't just carrying a secret, she was carrying a whole new chapter of Kyle's life across the ocean, about to hand it to him whether he was ready or not. The villa in Nice loomed closer with every mile, the weight of the truth pressing heavier on her shoulders. When the car pulled up to the villa gates, Summer almost told the driver to turn around. She almost convinced herself she wasn't ready, that maybe Kyle wasn't ready either. But then the little girl stirred, blinking her wide, curious eyes as if sensing they had arrived somewhere important. Summer took a deep breath and steadied her shaking hands, pressing a kiss to the top of the child's head. "We're here, honey," she murmured, forcing a smile she didn't feel. The gates creaked open, and the sprawling villa came into view, bathed in golden sunlight. It looked like something out of a dream, beautiful and untouchable, and yet it was about to become the backdrop of a reality that would change everything. Kyle was somewhere inside those walls, living his life, unaware that the past he thought he left behind was about to walk through his door in the shape of a daughter he never knew he had. Kyle was pacing inside the villa when the sound of tires crunching on the gravel reached his ears. He had been restless all day, unsettled by something he couldn't quite name, as though his life was on the edge of tipping into something he couldn't control. He rubbed the back of his neck and glanced out the window, his heart stalling when he saw the familiar figure stepping out of the taxi. Summer. He hadn't seen her in weeks, hadn't spoken to her beyond clipped, polite words that barely scratched the surface of everything left unsaid between them. But she wasn't alone. His eyes narrowed, confusion knitting his brow as he saw the small girl holding her hand, her little legs carrying her carefully toward the villa steps. Kyle's pulse quickened, a strange unease crawling through him. Who was the child, and why was Summer bringing her here, now? He stepped back from the window, his chest tightening with questions he wasn't ready to face. The moment Summer walked through the villa doors, the air shifted. Kyle stood frozen in the center of the room, his eyes darting between her and the little girl at her side. The silence stretched long, heavy with tension, until Kyle finally forced words past his lips. "Summer, what is this? Who is she?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the mix of confusion and something deeper he didn't dare name. Summer's throat went dry, her carefully rehearsed speech dissolving in her mind as she looked at him. She squeezed the little girl's hand, drawing strength from the innocent eyes looking up at her. "Kyle," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry the truth, this is your daughter." The words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, Kyle couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe Summer had lost her mind, maybe this was some cruel mistake. But as his eyes shifted to the child, something in him shattered. He saw it instantly, the familiar curve of her smile, the dimple in her cheek that mirrored his own, the same hazel eyes that had stared back at him in the mirror his whole life. His knees nearly buckled under the weight of recognition, his voice breaking as he whispered, "My daughter?" Summer nodded, tears pooling in her eyes as she crouched beside the little girl. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "this is your daddy." The little girl tilted her head curiously, her lips forming a shy smile as she looked at Kyle. And in that moment, everything in his world shifted, every piece of him realigned with the reality standing before him. Kyle sank onto the couch, his head in his hands, his emotions spiraling out of control. A father. He was a father. The word felt foreign on his tongue, yet it pulsed through him with an undeniable truth. He looked up at Summer, his voice sharp with a mix of anger and desperation. "Why didn't you tell me? Why would you keep something like this from me?" Summer swallowed hard, her eyes stinging as she met his gaze. "I wanted to," she admitted, her voice thick with guilt. "Every day, I wanted to. But the timing was never right, Kyle. And I was scared of what it would do to you, to us, to her. I thought I was protecting everyone, but now I know I was just running from the truth." Kyle's jaw clenched, his heart breaking as he looked between her and the child who was already clutching his sleeve with tiny fingers, as though instinctively drawn to him. The little girl's presence softened the storm brewing between them. She climbed onto Kyle's lap with the innocence of a child who saw only love, not secrets, not mistakes. Kyle wrapped his arms around her hesitantly, as though afraid she might disappear if he held on too tight. The warmth of her small body against his chest sent a surge of emotions crashing through him, joy, regret, love, fear, all tangled into one. He pressed his cheek against her hair, breathing her in as though trying to memorize every detail. "I missed so much," he whispered hoarsely, his tears falling freely now. Summer watched silently, her own tears spilling as she saw the bond forming before her eyes. This was what she had wanted, what she had feared, what she had dreamed of, Kyle finally meeting his daughter. But as the sun dipped lower over Nice, casting long shadows across the villa, the reality of what came next began to sink in. This wasn't just a reunion, this was the beginning of a storm that would ripple far beyond the walls of the villa. Families would be shaken, loyalties tested, and old wounds torn open. For now, though, in this fragile, fleeting moment, Kyle held his daughter for the first time, his heart breaking and healing all at once, as Summer stood beside them, silently praying that somehow, they could find their way forward together. The world of daytime drama is built upon a foundation of heightened emotion, where personal tragedies are not merely experienced but are orchestrated to their most devastating extremes. Within this realm, a scene such as the one where Claire falls in Miscarriage, followed by Kyle slapping Audra for causing the disaster, operates as a quintessential example of the genre's power to explore human frailty, guilt, and the catastrophic consequences of impulsive actions. This particular sequence of events is not just a plot point, it is a meticulously constructed emotional avalanche that rolls through the lives of its characters, leaving indelible scars and altering relationships in its wake. To understand its full impact, one must dissect the layers of character motivation, the symbolic weight of the miscarriage, and the complex moral and emotional repercussions of the slap, all of which combine to create a moment of profound narrative significance. The foundation of such a calamitous event is always laid well in advance, built upon the intricate web of relationships and tensions between the characters involved. Claire, at this point in the narrative, likely represents vulnerability, hope, or perhaps a newfound stability that is tragically fragile. Her pregnancy is seldom just a biological state, it is a symbol of the future, of potential, of love solidified into a promise. It represents a chance for renewal, perhaps for Kyle as well, an opportunity to build something good and pure amidst the constant scheming and moral compromises that define their environment. Therefore, any threat to this pregnancy is not merely a threat to her physical well-being but an assault on hope itself. Audra, by contrast, typically exists in a sphere of ambition, manipulation, and often, profound insecurity masked as confidence. Her actions, whether intentionally malicious or recklessly careless, are invariably driven by a complex cocktail of motives, a desire for power, a need for attention, jealousy, or a twisted form of self-preservation. The conflict between her and Claire, or her and Kyle, is never simple. It is the clash of two fundamental forces, creation versus destruction, hope versus cynicism, stability versus chaos. The fall itself is the physical manifestation of this clash. It is the moment where the abstract tensions become brutally real. The environment is likely chosen for its symbolic value, a grand staircase in a mansion, representing the precarious social heights these characters navigate, or a public gathering, where private pain is magnified under the glare of public scrutiny. The actual push or trip, whether a deliberate shove born of a heated argument or a careless gesture during a physical altercation, is almost secondary to the emotional intent behind it. The audience witnesses the event in slow motion, understanding the gravity before the characters themselves do. The sound effect of the fall, the gasp from onlookers, the shot of Claire's terrified face, these are all tools used to maximize the visceral impact. The miscarriage that follows is the inevitable, heartbreaking conclusion. In the language of soap opera, it is the ultimate loss, the theft of the future. It is a pain that is both uniquely personal to Claire and universally understood by the audience. It is a wound that does not simply heal, it becomes a part of her character's fabric, a ghost that will haunt her subsequent storylines. This event transforms her, plunging her into a grief that is all-consuming and isolating, even when surrounded by others. It is from the depths of this immediate, shocking grief that Kyle's slap erupts. His action is one of the most raw and controversial moments in the sequence, a point of no return for his character. To understand the slap is to understand the complete and total shattering of a man in a single moment. Kyle is not just a partner or a husband, he is an expectant father. His identity has already begun to shift towards that role, investing his own hopes and dreams in the life growing within Claire. The sudden, violent erasure of that future is a psychological earthquake. His reaction is therefore not one of calculated anger but of pure, unadulterated animalistic grief. The slap is a physical expression of a pain that has no words. It is the externalization of an internal scream. In that moment, Audra is not just a woman who caused a fall, she is the embodiment of the catastrophe itself. She is the reason for the void, the cause of the silence where there should have been a heartbeat. By striking her, Kyle is striking out at the injustice, the randomness, the unbearable cruelty of it all. However, the moral complexity of the narrative ensures that this act cannot be seen as simply justified. The slap immediately introduces a troubling and necessary ambiguity. While the audience's sympathy may lie overwhelmingly with Kyle and Claire, the physical assault of one person by another, particularly a man striking a woman, is presented as a profound transgression. It is a line crossed. In his rightful grief, Kyle has committed a wrong. This moment ensures that he is not a flawless hero but a flawed human being capable of being broken down to his worst instincts. It complicates the audience's relationship with him. We understand his pain, we may even feel the visceral desire for retribution that he acts upon, but we are also forced to witness the shock and shame that registers on his face immediately after his hand makes contact. The slap echoes in the silence that follows the chaos, a sound as damaging as the fall itself. For Audra, the slap is a transformative event in its own right. Depending on her degree of culpability, it can either be a moment of comeuppance, a deserved punishment that finally checks her relentless scheming, or it can be a moment that twists her further. The physical sting might pale in comparison to the public humiliation and the branding of her as a monster. It could fuel a deeper, more bitter resentment, turning her from a mere antagonist into a truly vengeful force, thus perpetuating the cycle of pain and retaliation.